Hello, Now Playing listeners, and welcome to another Now Playing podcast book review. This is Arnie, co-host of Now Playing, and I realize I'm behind schedule on book reviews. This one, not to mention the King series, but how could I ever get back to the King series if I didn't finish reviewing Lauren Weisberger's Prada trilogy? I'm sure you've all been waiting with bated breath. But hey, when I was a college professor teaching students, I would often get asked, if I turn in my homework late, can I still get partial credit? And I always said yes, so hopefully, listeners, you will have that grace with me. It has been 2 months since The Devil Wears Prada 2 opened, and while I hoped to get this book review out sooner, it does allow us some perspective, because this has been a year where franchise movies go to die. Masters of the Universe, kind of a franchise that never was in theaters, but Supergirl, Mortal Kombat 2, Mando and Grogu, franchise films that aren't animated are not doing that well, but Devil Wears Prada 2 is the 6th highest grossing film domestically in the first half of 2026. The 4th highest live-action film because Toy Story 5 and Super Mario Galaxy are numbers 1 and 4 respectively. The others above it are Michael, Project Hail Mary, and Obsession, and that makes The Devil Wears Prada 2 the highest grossing non-animated franchise film of 2026 so far. It's made almost $700 million globally, making it the 4th biggest film, although I'm sure it's going to drop to 5th because Toy Story 5 hasn't been open long enough to overtake it. But Devil Wears Prada 2 is a much bigger film at the box office than the first one, which ended with $125 million domestic, $325 million global, and Disney strutted like they were on the catwalk when they announced The Devil Wears Prada was a $1 billion grossing franchise. Though yeah, 2/3 of that did come from this sequel. But 13 years before that sequel movie, Lauren Weisberger wrote a sequel book that the movie had nothing to do with. That book was Revenge Wears Prada, The Devil Returns, coming out in 2013, which is 10 years after The Devil Wears Prada was originally printed and 7 years after the movie was a smash. Weisberger returned to the story. Now, why would she do that? Some might say that after a decade of that book's success, maybe she was feeling sentimental. More cynical people, like me, would say she wanted to go back to her biggest success. The Devil Wears Prada was her first novel and the biggest success of her career thus far. And one thing I learned since doing that book review is she had a lot of guidance writing it. Early copies of that book were sent to Anna Wintour and others, including her assistant, who Emily was based on, and that book was much harsher, with more casual sex, drug use, and people guided Weisberger's hand in correcting that. The book had been bought by Fox Pictures after only 100 pages of it were written. And Fox executives, wanting their investment to pay off, plus many others, provided lots of, shall we say, guidance on how Weisberger should shape that initial novel. The book she did after that didn't have so many cooks in the kitchen. And her second book was a huge success for her. It's called Everyone Worth Knowing. It came out in 2005. She got a $1 million advance on that. Astronomical for an author who's only had one book out, compared to the $250,000 she got for Devil Wears Prada, which also is groundbreaking and nothing to sneeze at. But there were a lot of articles written around that time asking, is Weisberger worth $1 million? The Observer wrote an article called Devil Writes Nada, Why is Weisberger Getting $1 million? And pointed out nobody knows if she's a one-hit wonder, but she did leave Doubleday, who published The Devil Wears Prada, and went to Simon & Schuster, who were offering her the 7-figure payday. Before that second book even came out, she got another $1 million advance for her third novel. And Weisberger didn't even have an idea for what the third book would be. But publishers had at that point decided Weisberger was the brand, not Devil Wears Prada. So the second book came out, Everyone Worth Knowing. And it's the story about, tell me if you've heard this one before, an unfashionable young single woman thrust into the glamorous New York City lifestyle. She keeps coolly detached from it while enjoying its perks, but loses personal connections with family and friends while she's living it. Now, no, I didn't read this book. It got bad reviews and was called a rehash of The Devil Wears Prada, but harsher, as it did have the casual sex and illegal drug use and women starving themselves for thinness that reportedly were removed from that first Devil Wears Prada book. Everyone Worth Knowing debuted at number 10 on the New York Times bestseller list. Again, this is nothing to sneeze at, but it fell off the New York Times list entirely after 2 weeks, and sales, according to articles, were described as disappointing, which can't be good if you're Simon & Schuster and have already handed her $2 million. The third book she wrote was called Chasing Harry Winston, and this one also has a little bit of a backstory that explains why Weisberger might go back to the well of Devil Wears Prada. I read an article in the Daily News, so that's a gossip rag. Take this with a bit of salt. But in 2006, they reported that Weisberger's third novel wasn't coming along because she had writer's block. She had written several chapters, and her editor told her to trash them. An anonymous source told Daily News she actually wrote several chapters, but she was basically told they sucked and she has to start over. And Weisberger was telling people she hadn't even started the third book, supposedly to save face because of how bad the book was being received. No one at her publisher, her agent, or Weisberger herself would deny these rumors to Daily News, which is a big enough source that if it's an outright fabrication, you might release a denial. But somebody did respond, and I love this. Anna Wintour's spokesman at that time, Patrick O'Connell, did reply, telling the Daily News, maybe she should get a job as someone else's assistant. That is wonderful. But that third book did get published. It was called Chasing Harry Winston. It was about 3 New York City girls, all about to turn 30. The main one is a Brazilian who wants to get a Harry Winston engagement ring before she turns 30 and gets wrinkles. How progressive. This book got horrible reviews. Entertainment Weekly named it the worst book of 2008. And while Weisberger did get another payday as this was optioned for a film, nobody ever made a film on this, possibly because the book is not liked. Weisberger did do one more book before coming back to Devil Wears Prada. In 2010, Last Night at Chateau Marmont. It debuted at number 9 on the New York Times bestseller list, and it was a little bit of a change of pace after 3 virtually identical books, but it has similar themes. This one focuses on a male instead of a woman. He's a musician, and he suddenly becomes famous, and guess what? His job causes problems with his marriage and his personality. Same story again. Reviews were mixed on this one. Not as bad as Chasing Harry Winston, certainly not as good as Devil Wears Prada. So here we have Lauren Weisberger, a successful and very rich novelist, but keeps telling the story of a person thrust into glamour and having it cause personal problems 4 times in a row. And her sales were good, but nothing came close to The Devil Wears Prada. She was described as an author whose timing and inside story about Vogue and Anna Wintour mattered more than her craft. It launched her career, and she was able to maintain it, but never achieve Prada success again. Though I'm guessing those advances allowed her to buy plenty of Prada and Gucci and Louis. But her hook couldn't be repeated, and she couldn't build an audience. She had one huge hit, and then a long tail attached to it. Hear me out on this. I think she's the literary equivalent of Meatloaf, the singer, not the dinner. Bat Out of Hell is a cultural phenomenon. as was the novel The Devil Wears Prada. Meatloaf released other successful albums, but none as big as Bat Out of Hell. Same as Weisberger keeps putting out books. Most artists would kill for the type of sales Meatloaf was getting, but fans and critics kept comparing the sales and the music to Bat Out of Hell. And compared to that huge success, it all seemed like disappointment. The same as Weisberger sold books, but got mixed reviews and lesser sales. Now, eventually, Meatloaf went back to the well and did Bat Out of Hell 2 and had his second biggest commercial success. And Weisberger also went back to the well too with Revenge Wears Prada, but she wasn't as successful as Meatloaf. If Revenge Wears Prada was the second movie, that wouldn't be Weisberger's I Would Do Anything for Love, but I Won't Do That. Maybe it would be Life's a Lululemon and I Want My Money Back. Now, there are some reasons for this, and they're not all on Weisberger. Publishing changed a lot between 2003 and 2013. There was the 2008 financial crisis, which caused publishers to consolidate. Bookstores were dying already at the turn of the century thanks to conglomerates like Barnes & Noble and Walmart, and now those stores are struggling because of ebooks. So yes, Weisberger went back to her most famous success to do her fifth book. Now, unlike her other books, there have been no published accounts of how much she got in advance, but according to people in the know, an established IP brings in much more of an advance than an original work. It also works as an attempt to cast a wide net, bring back the readers who haven't read her since 2003, which may also cause the ancillary success of pumping up sales of her previous books. Some people who read Devil Wears Prada may not even know she had books since that first one because they weren't hits. And it mostly worked. Revenge Wears Prada, The Devil Returns debuted at number 3 on the New York Times hardcover bestseller list in 2013, her highest place since Devil Wears Prada. There was lots of media coverage because of the success of the original book and the movie, but this did not have the long-lasting staying power of The Devil Wears Prada. It never got adapted to a movie. When making the sequel, Disney and its creators didn't look at this at all. The publisher has never said what the sold number is, whereas they love to tout that when it's huge, X million copies sold. So we can assume it sold well, but it was no Devil Wears Prada. And to me, the whole thing smells like a cash grab. Not that Weisberger had something to say about her characters a decade later. And reading the book, I can tell you she really had nothing to say. So, what is the book about? No, I'm asking you, what is this book about? I've read this book. I've been chewing it over for weeks. And seriously, what is this book about? I'll start with the positive. It reads like a generic chick lit novel. It's third-person prose, unlike the first person of the first book, but it is a tight third-person point of view. We're always in Andy's head, and we never know the things Andy doesn't know. But it doesn't read like a journal the way The Devil Wears Prada did with its first-person perspective. Now, normally at this point in one of my book reviews, I do a plot summary, but this book is strangely plotless. It just goes on and on. So let's talk about, if not the plot, the situation. Andy Sachs is back. It's been 10 years for her, as it is for us, and she still has PTSD from her time working for Miranda Priestley. This trauma comes up time and again, even though Andy has become hugely successful in her own right. We're told later in the book, through flashbacks, she worked as a writer over the past decade, and after a few years of freelance, she ended up being an editor for a wedding blog. She just happened to run into former coworker Emily Charlton in New York City. If you don't remember, Emily was Miranda Priestley's first assistant, while Andy was the second assistant, so Emily was sort of Andy's boss and nemesis, and we find out Emily was also fired by Miranda. Emily convinces Andy they should start a fashion magazine focused on her niche of weddings, and they call it The Plunge. Emily held a fundraising event where they get big money investors, including a guy named Max Harrison, heir to the Harrison Media Holdings. Max then introduces Andy to a rich socialite who's featured on the first issue of The Plunge. So Weisberger literally writes in the prose that Andy's connection got them their big coverage for their first issue, but it was Max's connection. And Max is a friend of Emily's husband. So it's Emily who got them everything, including Max to invest most of the money in The Plunge. So if you take a step back, Andy is a useless, do-nothing character. Everything Andy has is because of her time at Runway with Miranda. That's where she met Emily, and Emily, not Andy, had the idea to start a magazine. Emily, not Andy, had the high-money contacts to finance the magazine. Emily and Andy repeatedly, fraudulently dropped Miranda's name to get interviews and media access. And it's Emily's big-money friends, including Max, that got the magazine started, and who Andy married. So what I wonder is, does Weisberger realize she's written a character who has had everything handed to her? Or are we to think that Andy reinvented herself and built her own life? The writing never makes any sly allusion to this, and Weisberger doesn't seem to be an author who's strong with subtext. I think Weisberger, in tying the books together, doesn't even realize Andy has had everything handed to her, and it's all a result of her time at Runway. Similar to how you could say Weisberger had everything handed to her because of her time at Vogue and writing a tell-all about it. So right away, I don't have a lot of sympathy for this Andy who has money, access, a successful magazine, and a hot husband. And it's mentioned that her biggest coup at The Plunge was getting an impossible photographer to shoot a wedding for the magazine. She actually made that happen herself. But it's her wedding. It wasn't for the magazine. It was for her own vanity. The only thing I can say about this Andy is that she's somewhat nice to her assistants and to other people's assistants, and I assume that's because she was treated badly when she worked as one. But a lot of that, as I said, is told in flashback. The first pages of the book start with her wedding to Max, and we learned the aforementioned backstory as the book goes on. And right before the wedding, on the first couple pages, Andy finds a note from Max's mother, Barbara, telling Max, "Don't marry that woman, get back with your ex, Catherine." Andy finds out from this note that Max saw Catherine while on his bachelor party trip and spent time with her, and he never told Andy about seeing her, so Andy is plagued with thoughts, did he cheat? And Max, from page 1, is not trustworthy. We're told Andy thinks of him as her best friend and a doting boyfriend who supported her work. But it's also said repeatedly and not subtly that Max's dad's company, the Harrison Media Holdings, was having money troubles due to his dead dad's bad financial decisions. They've had to sell their summer houses, cut back on their lifestyle. Their most prestigious magazine, called Yacht Life, hasn't made a dime in 10 years, but Max keeps calling it the most valuable of Harrison's holdings. So I'm already wondering, what's up with Max? What's up with Harrison Holdings? What's up with Yacht Life? Is there embezzlement? If Max is calling Yacht Life the most valuable of the holdings, I start thinking about There's Always Money in the Banana Stand from Arrested Development. Is Yacht Life where he's hiding a fortune? No, the Yacht Life thing never really pays off. But the financial downturn for Harrison Holdings is mentioned so many times that if it didn't become Max's secret, and I say that in quotes, motivation, it would be akin to Chekhov hanging the rifle on the wall, talking about it every chapter, and then forgetting it exists. Weisberger handles this revelation of Max and his money trouble with all the subtlety of a whodunit that repeatedly points out the butler has a suspicious bulge in his coat, like one that would be made by a dagger with a jewel-encrusted handle. Then, a couple chapters later, the body is found dead. Sticking out of his back is a dagger with a jewel-encrusted handle. 300 pages pass, and then it's revealed, in a dramatic final twist, that the murder weapon was a dagger with a jewel-encrusted handle and the butler did it. And Andy seems unconcerned with the financial stability of Harrison Media Holdings. That's her husband's company. Why does Andy care so little, and why does the book bring it up so much? Now, given all this drama of the letter, Harrison Media Holdings, Max maybe cheating, I thought his wealthy mother Barbara might be the new Miranda of this book. But no, Barbara is present but hardly a major character. The only thing Barbara approves of is that Andy knew and used to work for Miranda. Barbara drops the line, all the girls Max grew up with would have killed to work there, finding a way to shoehorn in that tagline from the first book and, of more note to readers, I think, that first movie. But Barbara doesn't think Andy's from the right family, not wealthy enough to marry her son Max and help rebuild Harrison Media Holdings. But Andy herself isn't really a likable character here. Not only has everything been handed to her, but she's cyber-stalking her ex, Alex, both during her amazing romance with Max and after her wedding. There's some revisionist history going on here, that Alex had been, quote, her confidant, her partner, her best friend. But in the previous book, I read it. That's not the case. She'd gone on a Euro trip without him, ignored him repeatedly, and never took their relationship seriously, to the point that when she was moving to the city, she didn't even consider moving in with him. But now the sequel book mutates that, saying that Andy had fantasies of marrying Alex and felt weird a decade later marrying Max and not Alex. Alex is mentioned so often that I hated Andy for her disinterest in the husband she supposedly loves, and I knew Alex had to come back into the story because this was about as subtle as Max's financial troubles. And Andy's PTSD about Miranda also seems overly dramatic. Of course, Miranda runs in the same circles as Harrison Media, but when Miranda shows up at a party, Andy acts like Jason Voorhees just walked in with a machete. Weisberger's writing, I think, exacerbates all of my frustration because she doesn't trust her reader to remember information for more than 3 pages. She's basically putting up flashing neon signs that say, "Pay attention to this!" desperately trying to make sure the most unsavvy of readers doesn't miss the point. And everybody is acting so juvenile, and the writing feels juvenile. The book discusses sex and adult relationships, but has the subtlety and maturity of YA fiction. By the end of chapter 5, when Andy still won't confront her husband, her supposed best friend, her supposed partner, about the note, but is just endlessly neurotic about if he cheated and refuses to sleep with him, I'm just exhausted by her. And as for the plot, I'm again asking, is the plot that he cheated? No, that's just time wasting. 5 chapters, 70 pages, but only 2 days in Andy's life. 2 days in which she just had 2 days in which she had just gotten married and then abandoned her husband emotionally as she got wrapped up in her own paranoia rather than talk to him. In chapter 5, that famous photographer she got says, quote, "Show me a beautiful woman, and I will show you a man who is tired of, well, you've probably heard the rest," unquote. Yes, I have, and I'm tired of Andy's. But this isn't the plot. It's just something that happens. And Andy finds out she's pregnant. That's not the plot. It's just something else that happens, and she ends up being visibly pregnant for much of the book. It changes Andy's character some, but it doesn't impact any story beats. It does force her to get over her distrust of Max and have a conversation with him so they can be happy parents. But of course, I never trust Max. And when Alex shows up in New York, not a shock, and Andy then starts meeting Alex in secret from Max, I'm judging her very harshly for it, as it's the same thing she got so upset with Max for doing. Now, at least Weisberger realizes this turnabout and addresses Andy's hypocrisy. But hey, I'm now halfway through the book. What's the plot? As much as this book has one, It's probably the story involving The Plunge, that magazine Andy owns with Emily, and Emily is far more a character here than in the previous book. Now, it is ridiculous to think that Emily and Andy just ran into each other and suddenly were BFFs and business partners, but I do like that Emily told Andy she was, quote, a first-class bitch, unquote, during her time at Runway, because, yes, she was. But we're told Emily Googled Andy for years after Andy was fired, and that does not seem likely. And yet, strangely, this plot of Emily wanting to be Andy's friend is the one thing from this book that I did see in the sequel movie. But Nigel Googling Andy for years, I kind of buy that. Emily Googling Andy for years, that just seems far-fetched. And Andy just assumes Emily's husband Miles is a cheater, and if Emily knows, she doesn't care her husband sleeps around. But we, the audience, will never know if he does or not. It's throwaway prose from Andy's point of view. But I think the tail is chasing the dog, because the Emily in this book comes off a lot more like Emily Blunt's character from the movie than the Emily from the last book. She's short, to the point, and fashion-conscious, pragmatic, but also friendly to Andy. But their magazine they've done together, at Emily's idea, The Plunge, has done so well that Elias Clark, the publisher that owns Runway, wants to buy it for a very large sum of money. And it's revealed that Miranda herself, much like Anna Wintour, got a promotion and is now head of creative. It's Miranda who wants to buy The Plunge and run it next to Runway. And no matter how much money they're offered, Andy refuses to work for Miranda again. And Andy would be willing to sell, but it's in the contract that Andy and Emily must stay with The Plunge for 1 year after the sale. And here we have a lot of echoes. It becomes another 1 year of Andy having to work for Miranda. Last book, she was told, work for Miranda for 1 year and you can have your pick of jobs in publishing. This book, she's told, work for Miranda for 1 year and you can be a wealthy retiree or move on to other work. And now I think, hey, the book has a plot. But while a couple of hints are dropped earlier, it isn't until chapter 9, 150 pages in, over a third of the way into the book, that this starts getting hinted at, and 48% of the way into the book, thank you Kindle app, page 204, before the offer comes in and Miranda is back in the book. And then things happen around it, but there's no escalation, there's no tension, there's no back and forth. Emily wants to sell and is excited to be back among Miranda, and Andy staunchly refuses because of her emotional scarring. And Emily tells Andy, quote, it's an opportunity a million people would kill for, unquote. So there's that line again. I do like that she keeps bringing it back. That is kind of clever that she works it in. A true compliment. I'm not being sarcastic. But this book is called Revenge Wears Prada, The Devil Returns. That title is a lie. There's no revenge. These two are so far beneath Miranda, she barely remembers them. I thought that maybe they'd refuse to sell the magazine and then Miranda would try for revenge, try to run them out of publishing, start her own wedding fashion magazine with her empire that could crush their startup. Nope. Miranda's in the book a little. First, she's actually trying to suck up to Andy to convince her to sell, and then her true controlling nature comes out and entrenches Andy to not sell, and that's the end of Miranda in the book. And while it's realistic that beyond a couple catty statements from a publicist, Anna Wintour is so far above Lauren Weisberger that she wouldn't seek revenge even after the tell-all is published, with a title like Revenge Wears Prada, I really wanted Miranda to be a villain in this. Instead, she's barely in it. And then I really thought there was a fun subplot in the book coming. Andy's covering a celebrity wedding during all of this. It's just kind of a mishmash of things happening in the book. The fictional movie star is Olive Chase. She went online for online dating. Still kind of novel in 2013. And she met an unremarkable computer programmer from Louisville, Kentucky, who had barely heard of her until they started dating. Now, again, I'm looking for a plot. A computer guy meets a superstar on a computer dating site in 2013 and doesn't know who she is? I thought for sure this was catfishing. It's going to be a hacking thing. It was going to come out this programmer was bait and switching Olive Chase the way Max had kind of bait and switched Andy by not being honest with her and so on. And then there's an entire mystery. Olive calls off the wedding. Why does Olive call off the wedding? Well, we're never told, and then she does marry this guy from Louisville, and there's no ulterior motive, no secret plot to meet her. What a waste. So also in the book, we get a couple other obligatory cameos of returning characters. Nigel, who was a minor character in the first book, unlike Stanley Tucci's character in the first movie and second movie, he comes back for a scene or two. Lily, who was the best friend of Andy in the last book, moves away early in this novel. Christian Collinsworth, the writer who Andy slept with in Paris, he comes back for a bit. None of them really matter at all. But it turns out everyone is conspiring against Andy. Just like the last book, Andy has no real friends. When she won't go along with what the majority want, which is selling to Miranda, they betray her. If you care about the specifics, you can read the book, but it's unfulfilling. I don't think I'm spoiling anything because, of course, Max's need for money causes him to stab his wife in the back, figuratively, not with a jewel-handled dagger. And there's another subplot about Andy joining a prenatal group for rich women and one's having an affair, and it turns out to be a connection to Andy's past, even more ridiculous than running into Emily in a New York City cooking class. And all this happens in what's less like a climax and more like a wrap-up. I'll say this. Every time I read this book, I was endlessly shocked at the percentage of the book Kindle kept telling me had passed and nothing happened in the book. And then equally shocked when the finale hit. It really did feel like Weisberger was just hitting her word count and considering it done. This book shows no character growth for Andy because at the end of the book, instead of dealing with her problems, she just walks away, identical to how she walked away from Miranda in the last book. And that's her victory? To say fuck it and walk off, and I'm supposed to root for that? Despite everyone in the book other than Andy being evil, everyone also has a happy forgiveness ending that feels far more like we see at the end of the Devil Wears Prada 2 movie than I would have expected. And when I read The Devil Wears Prada, I liked it better than this book, but I did feel it was really dated in 2003 with its references to Bill Clinton's oral sex scandal, renting movies at Blockbuster, and the movie Sliver, and talking about turquoise IMAX. This book is equally dated, talking about Haiti earthquake victims, which was a huge tragedy, but nobody's talking about that anymore. It references Aperture software and Andy's new iMac with a 27-inch screen. It made me check the front to see if Apple paid for placement in this book. If they did, it's not disclosed, but I wouldn't put it past her. One of the Plunge's big weddings was Drew Barrymore marrying Will Kopelman. Who? I don't know Will Kopelman. I don't keep up with all Drew Barrymore's marriages. I had to look it up. It was her third marriage, married in 2012, divorced in 2016. And there's a reference to Demi Moore being uninteresting now that Ashton left her. I think history has proven that to be false. And Andy checks her DVR for something to watch. I remember my TiVo. But man, this book is so poorly written. There's one line. If I could have highlighted it 5 times, I would have. I can't not quote it. This is a direct quote from the book. "You're so dramatic," Emily sighed dramatically. That's the level of prose Weisberger writes. Again, is this supposed to be funny? It doesn't come off this way. It doesn't come off like a knowing joke of bad writing. It comes off like an editor asleep at the keyboard. So yeah, this book is terrible. Without being able to dish about Anna Wintour, it shows Weisberger really has nothing to say. It was really, really smart of everyone at Disney and Fox to read this book and realize this is not what a sequel to The Devil Wears Prada should be. So no, I didn't like the first Devil Wears Prada book, and I really disliked this book. I'm not going to go to the word hate. It's not the worst thing I've read, but it's tedious and unfulfilling. But hey, there's just one more for me to read and review. Just like Meatloaf went back again with Bat Out of Hell 3, Weisberger went back with When Life Gives You Lululemons. And I ask, is there any hope I might like the third book in this series if I didn't like the lauded first or the middling second? Yes, and I'll say why. Andy isn't in it. It's Emily's story. That could be a refreshing change of pace. But I have read it, and by the time you are hearing this podcast, I will have already been recording the review to come out tomorrow. I promise. In the meantime, if you want to hear my much more positive reviews of the Devil Wears Prada movies, those are available in the archives at nowplayingpodcast.com, where Brock, Marjorie, and I strutted down the catwalk reviewing the 2006 original and this year's smash hit sequel. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your patience with me as I record these reviews. And thank you for playing Now Playing Podcast.
The opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual hosts and may not reflect the views of Venganza Media Incorporated. All movie clips and music included in this podcast are the intellectual property of their respective copyright holders. They are included here for the purpose of review and no infringement is intended. Now Playing is a Venganza Media production, copyright 2026. And no part of this show may be reproduced, repurposed, or redistributed without the written permission of Venganza Media Incorporated. All rights reserved.